One of the most imposing ideas for an antagonist is someone who is so strong that no matter what you do against them, that they'll just adapt and become immune to whatever you just did. It's the ultimate my character beats your character sort of ability, because having to fight someone who can adapt and become immune to everything you do is a very terrifying concept. Though, with the most recent season of Jujutsu Kaisen ending a while ago, it showed off a newer antagonistic figure who fits in this category, being Mahoraga of the Ten Shadows. So, why not put Mahoraga up against the most iconic, unkillable monster out there, Doomsday? Obviously, this video will be a situation where the stats are equalised, meaning that the strength, speed and durability of the two combatants are made the same in order to make the fight more interesting, because, and I quote directly from one of the people in my comment section, "If Mahoraga and Doomsday have a normal fight without equal stats, Doomsday pushes Mahoraga down a flight of stairs and dies, so the stats are made equal in order to tell who's the better pound-for-pound fighter, between the Divine General Mahoraga or the unstoppable monster in Doomsday." If you're going to enjoy this video, make sure to like, subscribe. Shout out to Lumos Thermax, who is a very good DC scaler who assisted with this video. A link to his channel will be in the description below. Without further ado, let's get on with talking about Mahoraga versus Doomsday. The Ten Shadows technique is one of the most powerful techniques within Jujutsu Kaisen, passed down through one of the biggest clans in the world. This technique allows the user to summon animal-like Shikigami, each with their own individual abilities. These Shikigami abilities involve the likes of Nue being able to create lightning, Round Deer being able to heal things, Max Elephant being able to create water attacks, along with many other abilities. Due to the nature of being Shikigami, these are invisible to anyone who cannot use cursed energy, at least within Jujutsu Kaisen. The big drawback of the Ten Shadows is that the user themselves must be strong enough to beat them in a fight, so the user themselves also has to be pretty strong. However, the strongest Shikigami of a Ten Shadows user is none other than the Divine General Mahoraga, who is so powerful that nobody could ever tame him besides when the literal strongest sorcerer in history got a hold of him. Mahoraga is not only overwhelmingly strong, but can regenerate, and can adapt to, quote, any phenomena. Well, this is a bit of a no-limits fallacy. We do see Mahoraga adapt to some pretty wild things. This includes Sukura's Cleave and Dismantle, which are invisible, slashing attacks which can adjust themselves to the opponent's durability, Yorozu's Curse technique, which allows her to create and manipulate matter, and even Gojo's Infinity and Unlimited Void. Infinity is a technique that Gojo uses to manipulate space, essentially halving the distance between him and his opponent's attacks, in order to slow them down until they eventually stop and never reach him. A good way of describing it is comparing it to numbers. Say that the opponent is a 1 and Gojo is a 2. As the enemy tries to get closer to Gojo, Gojo halves the distance that they cover each time to get closer. For example, he'll half the power and speed to make it go down to a 1.5, a 1.25, a 1.125, etc. And since you can keep on having numbers indefinitely, it makes Gojo untouchable when it comes to conventional attacks, and Mahoraga adapted to that. Another example of Mahoraga adapting to spatial manipulation is resisting the pull from Gojo's blue, which erases space and forces space to compensate by filling in the space that was previously erased by dragging something else within it, yet Mahoraga is unaffected by this. Lastly, Unlimited Void is Gojo's domain expansion, which, when hit, fries the opponent's brain with information. This means that not only can Mahoraga adapt to attacks on the mind, but can even adapt passively, not needing to think in order to adapt. Without the adaptation, however, Mahoraga is still a force to be reckoned with, going back and forth with the King of Curses Sukuna, who has lived for thousands of years with a lot of combat experience. Mahoraga also wields the Sword of Extermination. This bladed weapon is embedded with positive cursed energy, which can erase curses on the spot, which further makes Mahoraga a more dangerous opponent to deal with within the world of Jujutsu Kaisen. The main problem with Mahoraga is that it's hard to tell the upper limits of its abilities and what its adaptation can do, since the statement of any phenomena is really just insane. Logically, it would at least mean that Mahoraga can adapt to anything within Jujutsu Kaisen at least. This would include Mahito's ability to manipulate the soul, the Death Painting's blood attacks which poison their target, a multitude of different elemental abilities, teleportation, Hakari's luck manipulation, and even abilities such as Haname's technique technique which can remove murderous intent from a person. There's also other abilities which are kind of weird to talk about with how they interact with Mahoraga. For example, Yuta's, Higuruma's, and Takuma. Yuta can copy any technique, Higuruma can remove cursed techniques, and Takuma can bring whatever he finds funny into reality. So this should go without question as to why it's weird to talk about, since you can very easily make the argument that Takuma just finds Mahoraga's adaptation funny and then it doesn't work, but you could also then argue that it works the other way around with Mahoraga adapted to Takuma's technique. Either way, I don't think it'll impact things too much in this fight. Now, due to how obscenely powerful Mahoraga is, it might be hard to think of a few weaknesses it has, but it does have a few. Well, Mahoraga isn't exactly mindless, he has no showings of IQ feats, and only ever shows up and fights, which makes sense considering Mahoraga's meant to be tamed and controlled, even if only one person in history has ever done it. Secondly, Mahoraga is at his most vulnerable at the start of a fight, due to the fact that it takes time to adapt to abilities. Granted, this time can be shortened in combat with repeated movements and blows, but it's not instantaneous, meaning that if you have an ability not yet used on Mahoraga, you would need to use that to one-shot it before it can adapt. Obviously, if you can't one-shot Mahoraga, it'll just regenerate and then adapt on afterwards, however. But how does Mahoraga do when fighting the monster that is Doomsday? Doomsday was a product of an experiment to create the ultimate life form in order to survive in the horrific, violent world the creator, Bertrand, lived on. In order to do this, Bertrand would take the same infant and kill it over and over again with the environment, taking the remains of the infant and remaking it into a clone, in order to make the clone more resilient to whatever last killed it, in order to create a truly unkillable creature. This then would go on to become Doomsday. Due to constantly being put through thousands of years worth of death and torture, Doomsday hated the very idea of life and began to adapt and evolve based on the things that previously killed it. With this, it's no surprise that what would actually happen when Doomsday goes up against his creator. I mean, what can you do against something that is as strong and as violent and as OP as Doomsday? The answer's pretty simple. You die. Which is what set Doomsday on a rampage across many different planets, killing everything in its path. Doomsday's adaptation is well known and for good reason, because it's absolutely insane. Anytime that Doomsday is quote-unquote killed, it'll just come back to life and be immune to whatever last killed it. Hell, Doomsday can even come up with new abilities on the fly in order to counter opponents' weaknesses, such as gaining the ability to create fire with its breath against Martian Manhunter, the ability to absorb energy and created mind attacks, and can even reflect attacks back onto people. Hell, Doomsday can even interact with things which are supposed to be intangible, so there's no way to really avoid taking hits from him. As much as this, is wild, he's able to adapt to even more insane stuff, such as being put in the Phantom Zone. The Phantom Zone is an interdimensional realm between universes, realms, and dimensions within the underworld of the macrocosm, which removes any tangible body of anyone in it, where they can never escape, age, or die. Yet, despite being literally stripped of its physical body, Doomsday was able to adapt and literally punch through it, which is a level of shithousery and overpoweredness that I could just not really comprehend. On the topic of Doomsday's physical body, however, it's actually pretty interesting to talk about, as his biology contains literally no organs, no blood tissue, or anything. The spikes on their arms as well is also just not for show either, because Doomsday can extend their size, and the spikes are also poisonous as well, as just another way that Doomsday can attack people. Doomsday can also regenerate without needing to come back from the dead, and has the ability of superhuman sight, which also can allow him to sense presence of other beings as well. Doomsday's unkillableness is also something which I've already talked about in a basic sense, but in terms of specific examples of what Doomsday has survived, well, it survived fire and energy attacks no problem, along with radiations, poisons, matter, and ice manipulation. More impressive abilities that Doomsday has been able to resist are attacks such as possession, mind control, and even soul attacks, but by far the most insane feat for me is being able to withstand Darkseid's Omega Beams. These can literally erase new gods from existence, which are platonic, transcendent beings. Hell, Doomsday can even adapt in terms of intelligence, getting smarter over time, and can very easily recognise weaknesses that an opponent has in order to counter them. Another thing which was brought up to me by Lumos, which I actually didn't really think about really, is the fact that Doomsday fights Superman a lot, typically on equal footing in terms of overall stats. But when you consider the fact that Superman is very well trained in martial arts, it would mean that logically he should have the edge on Doomsday in most physical fights, which is never really the case, implying that Doomsday itself is at least somewhat skilled in hand-to-hand combat. But how do you kill Doomsday? Well, if you take it as a permanent death, then it becomes really frustrating to put Doomsday down, as he can just keep on coming back from the dead. Of course, if you count victory as Doomsday's first death, then victory becomes much easier for the opponent. Doomsday can also get weaker with its own fear and agony if those factors are high enough. Regardless, however, Doomsday is disgustingly powerful in its own right, but can it take down the Divine General Mahoraga? This fight would be an absolutely insane watch from the background. Both Mahoraga and Doomsday's abilities to adapt to almost anything would make the fight constantly evolving, but I think the winner is quite clear. Since a lot of what Mahoraga has can be rendered mute by Doomsday, such as being invisible, as not only has Doomsday got enhanced sight, but can sense the presence of beings too, meaning that Mahoraga isn't exactly going unseen. Not to mention that Doomsday is smarter than Mahoraga and would at least be able to figure out what's going on and how to fight it pretty quickly. The Sword of Extermination is also a bit of a non-factor, as it can only erase curses and not other beings. This is made clear when Sukuna's hit with it, where he states that if he was a cursed spirit he would have taken lethal damage, but because he isn't, he was fine. And hell, even if Mahoraga's blade could erase anything, Doomsday has survived attacks which can erase even more powerful beings than Mahoraga can output, so Doomsday is going to be completely okay. Granted, it's still a sword, so I mean it's not like it's going to be useless in a fight, but it would have no more use than just being a weapon. Also, Doomsday is better in hand-to-hand combat when it comes to fighting Mahoraga. While Mahoraga can fight Sukuna, who is quite skilled in hand-to-hand combat, Superman outclasses him in my opinion. Especially when we consider the fact that Gojo is capable of outboxing Sukuna. While that might not really be a good counter-argument due to how skilled Gojo is, there is another thing that draws Sukuna's hand-to-hand combat skills back, as at the very start of the series, Sukuna was caught off guard by Yuji Itadori, and if Sukuna wasn't so overwhelmingly more powerful than Yuji, he would have landed a clean punch to Sukuna's side. Keep in mind that this is a 15-year-old boy who is barely trained at this point. So while I don't think the Sukuna is a complete bum in hand-to-hand skill, I don't see it stacking up to Superman at all, meaning that Doomsday would outclass Mahoraga in pure hand-to-hand fighting. Hell, you could even argue this line of scaling doesn't even apply to Mahoraga due to how Sukuna was beating it up constantly throughout the fight, which would only make the gap between Mahoraga and Doomsday's skill even bigger. But of course there's the big part of the matchup, which is the adaptation, which both sides do exceed at the better things than the other. For example, Doomsday's adaptation works much faster than Mahoraga's, but on the flip side, the argument can be made that Mahoraga's adaptations are much thorougher and stronger. Let me explain. If Doomsday is hit with an attack and he adapts to it, Doomsday can still be susceptible to those types of attacks if they are just much stronger than before. By comparison, Mahoraga can adapt to the very essence of someone's powers. For example, when he adapted to Sukuna's Dismantle and Cleave, it didn't just adapt to those specific attacks, but to all slashing attacks in general, which is displayed with when Sukuna uses his domain expansion, which is his strongest technique, and Mahoraga walks through it. Another instance is of Yorozu, where Mahoraga adapted to Yorozu's newly made matter attacks, but when Yorozu created a literal perfect sphere which creates infinite mass, which therefore then should be infinitely greater than the attack she was previously using, Mahoraga was still fine because it adapted to Yorozu's entire ability from before, if that makes sense. So whose adaptation is better? Well, if given time, I do think that Mahoraga's adaptation would be more of a pain to deal with. However, considering the fact that Doomsday can come back from the dead and the fact that it's faster at adapting than Mahoraga, I would say that it's not really going in Mahoraga's favour at all. Keep in mind that Mahoraga could only potentially put Doomsday down for good after adapting to its ability to come back to life, which it would need to experience at least once. By comparison, Doomsday only needs to kill Mahoraga once. Not to mention that Doomsday's proficiency in hand-to-hand combat and having a higher IQ means that I think that Doomsday is going to be able to kill Mahoraga before Mahoraga can adapt to anything, because Doomsday is just that guy. Even if you make the argument that Mahoraga can adapt to Doomsday's adaptation, then I'd spin that back on you and say that Doomsday would just adapt to Mahoraga's adaptation, and since his adaptation works faster than Mahoraga's, he'd win. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like, subscribe. Once again, shout out to Lumos Thermax for helping with this video. Comment below your thoughts on this matchup, and if you disagree with anything that I said, and I'll see you next time.